Hello, BookTube. I wasn't planning to make this video today, but then I was reminded, not that I'd planned it, but I was reminded that the 4th of November night is the anniversary of the death of Wilfred Owen. He died on the 4th of November 1918 while trying to cross the Sambre-Oise Canal. Wilfred Owen is probably the best known British poet of World War One, probably the most taught British poet of World War One. A lot of his poems are sort of etched on the national brain. I think partly because a lot his poetry came to its full sort of fruition in during World War One. He'd been writing poetry before World War One, but sort of war and the pity of war, to quote himself, seemed to bring out the best in him, which I hate saying because it almost makes it seem like a justification for his war, really, which it shouldn't be. I think also there's the element of the relationship with Siegfried Sassoon, the and Craig Lockhart, and and fundamentally, I think also the tragedy of his late death a week before the war was due to come to an end. The fact that his mother got the telegram announcing his death literally on Armistice Day. The stories and the quotes are that she got it as the bells of Shrewsbury Cathedral were ringing out to celebrate Armistice Day. All of that adds to the centrality that Wilfred Owen has in World War One poetry, and I think to some extent it is deserved. Actually, I don't know why I qualify with that. With some extent, I think it's deserved. I think his poetry is the poetry of World War One. There are other poets. There are some probably better poets, but I think Owen had got it in a way that perhaps others didn't. He was born in Oswestry in Shropshire in 1893. He wasn't quite as posh as you might think. His father was a station manager. He worked in and around Cheshire for most of Owen's life. He was brought up an Anglican, an evangelical Anglican, although his religion was drained slightly by World War One. In fact, I will quote from Jon Stallworthy's excellent biography of Wilfred Owen. A quote from a letter that he wrote that ends with here we go. Christ is literally in no man's land. There men often hear his voice. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man laid down his life for a friend. Is it spoken in English only and French? I do not believe so. Thus you see how pure Christianity will not fit with pure patriotism. This practice of selective ignorance is, as I have pointed out, one cause of the war. Christians have deliberately cut some of the main teachings of their code. So he had. I don't think he ever lost his, as that quote implies. I don't think he ever lost his religious belief, but I don't think he was quite the Christian that he was before the war started. He joined up in. He was in France in 1913 teaching English, and when the war started, he didn't rush to come back to England to join up. I mean, he even apparently considered joining the French army in 1914, but he came back to England and he joined up in 1915. He joined the Artists Rifles, but was made a second lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment in 1916. He then went out to France. There were a couple of very traumatic incidents which led to him being basically recognised as having shell shock, as it was called then, and he was sent to Craig Lockhart's hospital in Edinburgh, which is a subject worth a video on it in and of itself. There he was introduced to Siegfried Sassoon, and his interaction with Siegfried Sassoon changed the way he wrote his poetry. Some initially he was sort of copying or homaging, as the saying goes, Siegfried Sassoon, but it gradually developed into his own voice, and I think it was at that point that he kind of sort of really found his voice. He then went back. He could have probably at that point stayed in England or done base duties, but he insisted on going back to the front, and he went back to the front in August 1918. I think there was an element that he wanted to prove both. Well, he wanted to prove to himself that he was brave, and he wanted to burnish his credentials to be seen as a war poet, which is probably a bad choice of words because it makes him sound selfish and egotistical. But I don't think that's what it was. I think he wanted to say, my poetry is worth listening to because I have experienced the worst and the hardness, and I have shown that I have been judged and I have not been found wanting. Tragically, that meant he went back to the front line in October. He won a military cross actually on the 1st and the 2nd of October for actions on the 1st and 2nd of October. But a month later was killed. Now, one of the things about World War One that you often think about, and not just about Owen, it's the hundreds of thousands, the millions of men who died, whose potential was squashed. What they might have achieved, all these men, had they lived, what they might have achieved. Not just the poet. We remember the poets and the writers and the art scientists and as sort of families remember the members of our families, but the group loss of potential that comes from World War One is something we often pay lip service to. But we have illustrations. What Wilfred Owen might have achieved as he lived as long as Siegfried Sassoon, we'll obviously will never know. But it's something that you have to think about, and I also think it's something you have to think about every man that died. I mean, obviously, I'm talking. It's always ironic that you end up talking. Ironic's the wrong word again. I talk about this as if every man who died in World War One might have lived to be a hero or a poet or something. Some of them might have turned out to be gross villains and terrible people. But the cultural loss the cultural and societal loss that those people represent is immense, and you can't as a society not be damaged by that. But that's a sort of step away. I think what Owen represents as much as anything else is the poet as witness. There's a poem that I often quote by Anna Akhmatova called Requiem, which basically says the preamble to the poem is that she's queuing up outside a Moscow a prison to see her son. I'm trying to get to see her son, I think, and a woman in the queue recognises her and says something along the lines of, "Can you explain this? Can you describe this experience to us, of us to other people?" And Akhmatova says, "Yes, I can," and I think that's the best description of poet as witness that you'll ever get. I recommend Requiem as a poem, by the way, as a separate sort of thing. You should read it, and you should read Anna Akhmatova. She's there. Now, there was another quote from this book that I wanted to read. I'm sorry this is so disorganised, but as I said, this was Oh yeah, actually, this was why I was going to read it. Stallworthy in his book says he's the classic example of what would become a quintessentially 20th century figure, the poet as witness, and not a passive witness. Most of his later and greater poems are fueled by indignation. Introduced by Sassoon to the genre of protest poem, he soon outgrew the two-dimensional poster poem, such as The Deadbeat, and tapped deeper and richer imaginative levels than ever Sassoon would reach. And he, and I think that more than anything else, says like I'm going to read. I don't. I'm sorry, as I said, that this is as disorganised as it is. I also wanted to read two other quotes before I finish, and I'm going to read one poem, an odd one you don't hear very often, but I think that the end of it is brutal, and I think is worth reading for that reason. There's a quote I've got here from Owen himself that says, "I came out." It's from a letter. "I came out to help these boys, directly by leading them as well as an officer can, indirectly by watching their suffering, that I might speak of them as well as a pleader can." So poet as witness, poet as pleader, poet as as lawyer, perhaps, I don't know. Anyway, that's the the last but one quote. The other thing is there was Owen wrote a preface to his poems that I think it came out after he died or just before he died, and I think it's worth reading a chunk of that, which says, "This book is not about heroes. English poetry is not yet fit to speak of them. Nor is it about deeds or lands, nor anything about glory, honour, might, majesty, dominion, or power, except war. Above all, I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity." I think that's basically what I wanted to say. Wilfred Owen is a poet that I think you should read, and I think not just because your teachers tell you to read, because I think he's got things to say, and he is a voice of millions of men who were not necessarily voiceless, but who were never heard, and some of whom were never going to be heard after the war finished. And I'm going to read one poem here. It's got a religious theme to it, but as I said, I think, and I'm as not a great poetry reader. I want to read this because I think, as I said, the end of it is a kicker, and I like and the way the religious theme is done is quite good. It's called "The Parable of the Old Man and the Young." "So Abraham rose and clave the wood and went, and took the fire with him and a knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron. But where's the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abraham bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not do so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one." Here endeth today's lesson.